There we go. Cool. So recording is underway now, and that recording will be posted on YouTube. All right. Well, and because it's live streaming, Facebook should capture this as well. Okay, so a bit of a caveat with cannabis, also known as marijuana or pot or weed. All these terms circulate around this substance, and I want to acknowledge that there is tremendous difference with a lot of the nuance and the stigma and the history of all of these terms. And at the end of the day, they refer to the same substance and the same plant. So you'll hear Megan and I mainly use the term cannabis, but marijuana refers to the same thing as well. Same with all these others. All right, so here's our overview of the day. We're going to talk a little bit about the Washington Poison Center first, talk about who we are, what we do, and why we're talking about cannabis. We'll then provide a bit of an overview of the plant and substance itself of cannabis. Then we'll talk a bit about legality and regulation. We'll spend some time going over modes of use. We'll then have a kind of meaty section on health correlations, and then we'll wrap things up with acute or in the moment effects of cannabis intoxication. All right, so first starting about the Poison Center. First off, if you don't have this number in your phone, I highly encourage you, literally right now, just put it in your phone in case you ever need it. 800-222-1222. This is the national toll-free Poison Center hotline, and this will route you to your local Poison Center based on your area code. And it doesn't matter which one you're routed to. We all provide the same service. We're all always open. You can call us at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. Someone's going to answer. And we are also completely free. You never have to worry about billing or insurance or anything like that. We're also confidential, so the same laws and protections that keep your privacy safe in a doctor's office or a hospital, those HIPAA protections apply to us as well. And for anyone who would prefer a language other than English, we have interpretation services in over 260 languages. All right, so whenever you call the Poison Center, one of our SPIs will answer. And SPI is short for Specialists in Poison Information. Now, this is a group of amazing folks. We've got nurses, pharmacists, and poison information providers, and they have just a ton of experience. I believe currently our staff averages 13 years of experience in the call center. Now, if there is ever a case that they'd like some additional follow-up with, that they just want to make sure they have another set of eyes to look at, they will contact one of our on-call board-certified medical toxicologists. Now, there are 7 of these folks certified in the state of Washington, and I believe all of them are linked with the Poison Center. And so all of them offer that service, that on-call service. Now, just a little look at our 2019 data. Can't believe it's over halfway through 2020 already. What a year. So, in 2019, we had over 125,000 calls covering over 66,000 cases. Now, what this tells you is that we will do some follow-up whenever we can to make sure a given case, a given individual, is still doing okay. So, a good chunk of our calls, about 44% of our calls for 2019 at least, were for little kids. These are kids ages 6 and under, or younger than the age of 6, I should say. Now, this makes sense. Anyone who's interacted with kids know that they love to explore the world with their mouths, causing a great deal of stress to their guardians. And so most of these cases are fairly straightforward, are fairly easily managed. Now, we're not just for kids, though. We get a ton of calls about teenagers, adults, and older adults. And typically, for older adults, and whenever we say older adult, we mean someone ages 60 and up. Most of these cases are for medication errors and accidents, and these can be a lot more severe. And we'll go through some of the ways why a little later on. But without further ado, we're now going to dive into cannabis. First of all, cannabis, which is short for the term cannabis sativa, is a plant. First and foremost, it's a plant. Now, this same plant, it has a ton of different varieties. A lot of these can be used to form a bunch of non-drug products. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as hemp. Hemp can be used to make rope and soap and fabrics and other textiles, all sorts of interesting things. Now, this same plant or other versions of the same plant can be used to create a bunch of drug products. Now, to confuse things more, some of these drug products are what we call psychoactive or mind-altering or intoxicating, a few different terms for this, and then others are also non-psychoactive. And again, all of these we can call cannabis. Now, just a little bit of exploration of what we call the endocannabinoid system. This is the system that cannabis will act on or will activate. Now, everyone in on this call, every human, and I believe every mammal, has this endocannabinoid system in them right now doing its thing. And it is what we call a neuromodulatory system. Now, that means that it helps regulate a series of other systems within the body. Now, you'll hear us use the term cannabinoid a few times. This is just very generally any chemical compound that binds to the receptors of this system, of that endocannabinoid system. Now, a lot of the science behind cannabis and the endocannabinoid system is relatively recent. And so we're still learning more and more about it all the time. To date, we've identified about 100, or a little over 100 known cannabinoids. I believe 111 is the last figure I've seen. Now, this cannabinoids, we'll go through this in the next slide. Cannabinoids are either what we call endocannabinoids. These are the ones that are found in the body, regulated, produced by the body without any external stimulus. So these are just doing their thing. You'll hear us occasionally say anandamide. That is one of the main endocannabinoids. Now, a lot of cannabinoids also come from plants, such as cannabis. Now, we call these phytocannabinoids. Phyto means plant. But cannabis is not the only plant we see phytocannabinoids in. We've seen some in cacao, in echinacea, and a whole bunch of other things. But the main two phytocannabinoids we're going to talk about both come from cannabis. And the first is THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or CBD, and that's cannabidiol or cannabidiol. Now, for any chemistry nerds out there, here are the chemical representations of those. Not being a chemistry nerd myself, I'm not going to linger on those, but I will say that THC, it's the main psychoactive, again, intoxicating component in cannabis. Now, this is what's mainly responsible for folks feeling that physical high. It binds to receptors throughout the body, but it mainly focuses on receptors in the brain. So CBD, which I'm sure you've heard of, it's another cannabinoid. On its own, we don't believe that it is psychoactive. However, we do think that it can alter the effects of THC and other cannabinoids and potentially other medications. We'll go through some of that toward the end here. And we believe that it mainly binds to receptors throughout the body. So you'll recall just a few moments ago I mentioned anandamide. So anandamide is one of those main endocannabinoids that your body's just producing, and it's doing its thing. Now, THC is similar enough in shape to anandamide that it can land on and activate a lot of the same receptors. And when it does so, we think it tends to do so stronger, longer lasting, more robustly. Like I said, we're still learning more and more and more about what the endocannabinoid system actually does, but we believe that by regulating what we call neurotransmitters, that's a series of chemicals that can lead to a variety of effects, regulates a lot of different systems. By regulating these neurotransmitters or chemicals, it indirectly regulates a whole bunch of things, including stress and anxiety behaviors, systems of learning, memory, reward, and a lot more. So I'm sure folks in this training are aware that there are so many different cannabis products out there, right? So we see dried flower and bud. We see and I should say dried flower and bud. This is one of the less processed forms of cannabis. We also see concentrates, and as the name implies, those are far more concentrated. Those can be oils, which would be more of a liquid, and waxes, which can be more of a solid. And we also see tinctures, topicals, edibles, medications, so many different forms. There are a couple points I want to make on this slide. First is that regardless of the form here, regardless of the mode of use, all of these act on that same system, that endocannabinoid system. The other point is more products means more diversity, means more complexity in predicting effects because there's so many things to try to test. All right, now we're going to go ahead and switch drivers for a moment. Megan's going to take over for the regulations section. I'm going to lay eyes on the chat box and make sure I'm not missing anything.
I think you're good, Alex.
Perfect.
And as a reminder to folks tuning in on Facebook, please go ahead and just comment at any time with any questions that you have, and we will be sure to lay eyes on that and address anything that pops up there as well. Alrighty, everyone, so we are going to dive into a little bit of regulation before we get into modes of use and health correlations. So we can go ahead and get on to the next slide, Alex. And this has just a little bit of a history of cannabis legality, which is pretty interesting and pretty convoluted in the US. We really do not have the time to go into all of it today, but essentially, cannabis was legal until 1970 when Nixon signed into law what was called the Controlled Substances Act. So this act established the schedule system. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of like Schedule I drugs. So that's what that act did. It created this system where they put Schedule I drugs as any drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Cannabis was included in this definition. Other drugs in the schedule area were heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and meth. Cannabis is still a Schedule I drug, so it is still federally illegal. But despite all of this federal illegality, there were state movements to legalize. California was actually the first, and they legalized medical marijuana in 1996. Washington, we weren't too far behind. We legalized in 1998. And then about 15 years later, we saw the first retail cannabis legalizations in Washington and Colorado. So this map shows how momentum around legalization has spread ever since. Currently, there are 33 states that have medical marijuana and 11 states that have legalized both retail and medical. Legality doesn't just end with the medical systems, though. The US actually added on another layer with the Farm Bill in 2018. The Farm Bill removed hemp, which is defined as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC, from being a Schedule I substance. So because of this, there has been just like an explosion of CBD products that are derived from hemp. You can really find these products anywhere now, in grocery stores, pharmacies, gas stations. But some of them might be a little iffy in the health claims that they're making, as well as what they actually contain, because they are not regulated when they are outside of the retail cannabis market. We're going to dive into that aspect of CBD a little bit later on in the presentation. So now let's talk about Washington's system specifically. So we legalized in 2012 when voters passed I-502. Under our retail system, cannabis can only be legally purchased from licensed retailers, and you have to be at least 21 years old to purchase, possess, or use. There are also purchase limits for different products that are listed on this slide. When someone is in possession of cannabis, or if they're using cannabis, it's also illegal to do all of these things. It's illegal to use in public, to drive under the influence, to grow cannabis plants at home, unless you have a medical marijuana license. It's illegal to take across state and tribal lines. A lot of people aren't aware of this particular law. So, for example, even though Oregon also has a legalized retail system, you cannot legally take cannabis from Washington into Oregon or vice versa. It's also illegal to use on any federal lands, waters, or federally funded property. So you wouldn't be able to take cannabis to Olympic National Park because that is federal land. Or if you live in a housing development that is federally funded, that can also be illegal. So in addition to the retail system, we also have a medical system in Washington. accessing this system requires authorization from a healthcare provider. So to get this authorization, the person needs to document that they have received what's called the medical standard of care for a qualifying condition for at least 3 months. So essentially, they need to have tried other treatments before they are able to qualify for using medical marijuana. The red box here shows what the qualifying conditions are in Washington. Now, there are 2 things that we want you to understand with this. So first, not all of these conditions actually have robust evidence that backs up cannabis use. That doesn't mean that cannabis might not help with the condition. It very well might. It just means we don't have enough evidence at this time yet. But it might also mean that cannabis is potentially not the best treatment for a condition. The second thing we want you to know is that cannabis does not fix or cure these conditions, but it might help with the symptoms of the conditions. So for example, it's not going to cure cancer, but it might help with nausea that stems from receiving cancer treatments. So when someone is approved for medical marijuana, they are given a medical marijuana recognition card. This card then provides them access to a few different things, to higher purchase and possession limits compared to someone who would be buying under the retail system. There's no sales tax. Medical marijuana authorization lets you grow a set number of plants at home. And it also gives a person access to medical marijuana consultants. So these are specialized bud tenders or employees at cannabis stores who can help people select products that are based on their specific qualifying condition. Someone who is just purchasing through the retail system cannot receive this sort of specialized consultation or treatment consultation from a cannabis store. Alrighty, so now we're going to move on to modes of use, or how people get cannabis in their bodies. I'm going to check the chat box really quick. I don't think we have any questions. I'm not seeing any on Facebook either, so we will dive right in. All right, so before we talk about the different modes of use, I want you all to remember just, I don't know, 15 slides or so when Alex talked about the different cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. So when we talk about how people use cannabis, you need to keep in mind that in addition to there being a lot of different types of products, these products also differ by what is in them. Some products are just CBD, some products are just THC, and then some products have some ratio or combination of both cannabinoids. So smoking is going to be our first mode of use we'll cover today. So it involves heating dried cannabis plant material, so flowers or buds, until that material combusts or burns. The user then inhales the smoke, and they can do that with a pipe, a water bong, or a joint. So if Alex clicks that again, we'll see another, yep, there we go. So joints are like a rolled kind of cigarette, essentially with paper. There are also spliffs and blunts, which are also in that image that just popped up. These contain nicotine in addition to cannabis. The next mode of use is vaping. Vaping is actually at a lower temperature than smoking because the whole point is to heat a substance to just before combustion happens, which then releases an aerosol, and that's what the user then inhales. There are 2 different forms of cannabis that are vaped. There's dried flower and bud, which is on the left, just like what is used with smoking. And then there are concentrates, which, as the name implies, they are substances with very high concentrations of THC. You'll see down at the bottom there, 50 to 90% THC typically. So concentrates are formed by using a solvent to strip THC from cannabis plant material. And this leaves behind a sort of waxy substance that can come in a lot of different consistencies. The 2 main concentrates are CO2 oil, which is a liquid, and you can see that in the pen on the far right. And then there's butane hash oil. which is the image on the middle, basically, which can range from being really hard to being gooey to crumbly. So vaping requires using a vape pen, which can come in a lot of different styles. There are more disposable versions that are called e-joints. These come pre-filled, they're ready to use, they're typically pretty simple. And then they can go up to more complex pens that have refillable cartridges. Some of them have temperature control. Some of these pens, they are made for dried flower only. Others are made for concentrates only, and some have the ability to vaporize both. All right, and then there is dabbing. So some people think of dabbing as a form of vaping, but we think it's pretty different. So dabbing uses what is called a dab rig, and that's this glass bong-like contraption that you see on the slide. So to dab, it uses a concentrate. And so you put a dollop of a concentrate on like a little tool, which is then placed on the nail, which is that bucket looking part of the dab rig. That nail is superheated to 750 to 900 degrees. It's usually a blowtorch that heats it that way. So when the concentrate is placed on the nail, it's vaporized essentially. And the vapor is pulled through the water of the bong and then inhaled. So because dabbing uses concentrates, it's a very, very high concentration of THC that's being delivered extremely quickly to the user. And it can have a very rapid onset of effects. So that leads to one health concern with dabbing, that people can have potentially a much higher dose than what they intended. Another health concern you see there is that there's a potential for burns with those superheated components and using a blowtorch while you're potentially intoxicated. Alrighty, let's move on to our next mode of use, which is edibles or drinkables. So THC is fat soluble, so it can be integrated into some food and drinks. And there's really a wide variety of products. There's what you might traditionally think of as an edible, like gummies, cookies, brownies. But there's also sodas and teas and savory foods even, like popcorn and crackers. Edibles are generally dosed with 10 milligrams of THC per serving. But it's actually becoming more and more common to see products that have other serving sizes, so 5 milligrams or 1 milligram of THC per serving. I keep saying per serving because some products contain more than one serving, like the gummies we have here on this slide. That whole package actually has 10 gummies of 10 milligrams of THC each, so meaning the whole package has 100 milligrams of THC. For CBD, edible and drinkable products, there's actually no defined serving size, so you're probably going to see a lot of different amounts. One of the health concerns that's specific to edibles and drinkables is the delayed onset of effects. So sometimes it can take hours for someone to feel anything, and then the effects that they do experience can last for a long time. This is especially concerning with driving because someone may not think that they're feeling anything and they're good to go out and drive when in fact they are not. You may have noticed on the gummies package that there was a little red hand. That hand is the not for kids symbol, and it's required on all edible product packages in Washington. So the reason behind this requirement is that edibles are really appealing, and they oftentimes look just like regular candy or regular treats. So kids may not know that a product has cannabis in it, and they may accidentally eat that product. So this logo was actually developed in partnership between us at the Poison Center, the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board, and the cannabis industry. That's our phone number there down at the bottom of the logo in case a child does get into an edible. And it also just serves as a really good reminder to folks to keep products out of sight and out of reach of kids, or even preferably locked up. So the remaining modes of use are what we just broadly bucket as alternative methods. we're only going to give you some detail on tinctures and topicals today, but there are also so many other modes or methods. There's suppositories, there's medications. Really, it seems like every day there's some new way that cannabis is being produced and used. So as we go into tinctures and topicals, I want you to keep in mind that there is very, very little research on these methods. Most of the information I can share with you is from sites that are actually cannabis industry websites. So you need to take this information with a little grain of salt. So we'll start with tinctures. Tinctures are essentially cannabis-infused alcohol or vegetable glycerin-based solutions. So they're typically found in dropper bottles, like the ones that I have here on the slide, because the dropper lets the user have control over the dose that they're taking. So the user can either drop the tincture under their tongue, or they can incorporate it into food and drinks, which would make it really similar to an edible or a drinkable. Because there's this range in how someone uses a tincture, the onset of effects can really vary. So tinctures under the tongue typically have quicker effect than tinctures that are added to food or drink. Topicals come in lots of different forms. There's lotions, there's creams, balms, oils. These are generally non-psychoactive when they're used because cannabinoids that are put on the skin typically don't enter the bloodstream. The one exception to this are transdermal patches, and these have other chemicals that are added to them that enable cannabinoids to enter the bloodstream. So you can kind of think of these like the cannabis version of a fentanyl patch. So if topicals are non-psychoactive and typically don't enter the bloodstream, why do people use them? There are some commonly reported uses. These are not backed by evidence just yet, but they include pain relief, muscle soreness, tension, and inflammation. All right, last mode of use, which is actually a lot of different modes that we've just bucketed in one big category, CBD. So CBD, it's available in topicals and tinctures, edibles, drinkables, capsules, so many other different forms. What we want you to come away with today, though, is that even though hemp was removed from the schedule system, it was essentially legalized, there is no regulation for CBD products that are outside of a licensed cannabis retail store. So this means that the products you find in a grocery store or in a pharmacy, they might not be tested and they might have uncertain product quality. So some commercial CBD products might contain contaminants, or possibly the concentration of CBD that's listed on the label is less or more than what that label claims. So you just need folks who are interested in CBD products outside of a licensed store just need to understand that product quality may vary. Alrighty, we're going to switch back to Alex now. While we're doing that, I'm going to lay eyes on our chat box. All right, we have one from Sandra asking, does this mean that ordering CBD oil from another state is not legal? Alex, do you know the answer to that one?
My understanding is it's kind of nuanced. It would depend on where that product is sold. So if it was purchased in like a grocery store or pharmacy or something like that, then it's likely okay to go between states. But if it's sold from a retailer, a cannabis retailer, then those products likely have to remain in the state. Now, I'd have to verify some of the nuance with that because it gets way more complicated when you're looking into what is and is not allowed between states, but it's the best answer I have for you right now.
Awesome, thanks, Alex. And we had one more question asking if we're going to cover the effects of different dosages, like what does 10 milligrams of THC do to you? My answer to that is sort of. Stay tuned when we get into the health correlation section because we do talk a little bit about dosages, but the dose for an individual is highly dependent on that person's metabolism, their reaction to the substance. So it's really hard to pinpoint the exact effects of specific dosages. And Alex, you can add on to that too if you have other things to say.
Yeah, I think you covered the gist of it, that everyone has a different endocannabinoid system and use history and metabolism and all these other factors that contribute into how a given body processes a given substance, including cannabinoids. We're getting more questions. So, interesting one. I haven't thought about this exactly. How is price determined, and does it vary from store to store? It would. I believe a lot of this would be up to Liquor and Cannabis Board. That's the Washington State's regulating body around cannabis product. But I wager there is also some variation between store to store. But we have not conducted that exact research. Right, cool. I'm going to move on for now, just for the sake of time, but please keep asking questions as you have them. We'll do our best to address them. All right, so we're going to look a little bit at cannabis labeling, because they can be a little confusing. First thing to point out is that this symbol here, this is Washington State's universal symbol that indicates this product contains THC, and it's only specific to THC. So if you purchased a CBD product in another area, sorry, I'm getting some road work outside, it seems like. I hope that's not picking up on the mic too much. But if you purchase a CBD product, for example, or a device that doesn't actually have any substance in it, this symbol is not required to be there. Oh, and there's more road construction. Gotta love that timing. Well, we just keep on pushing on. So folks may have heard of what we call indicas or sativas. You might recall that earlier I mentioned the scientific name for this plant is Cannabis sativa. Cannabis indica is sort of a cousin to that plant. Now, a lot of times indicas and sativas are sort of used to describe effects or to organize different strains or types of these products. Now, a lot of folks may assume that indica might have more CBD and thus lead to what folks call a body high, or more of that physical sensation, whereas sativas might have more of that psychoactive, intoxicating, what we call head high, because it might have more THC. Now, sometimes this is true, a lot of times it's not at all true. So even if a package says indica or sativa, you're most likely going to see a breakdown of of cannabinoids as well as what we call terpenes. So I'll show that on this next slide here. So terpenes they're not specific just to cannabis. They're aromatic compounds in a variety of plants and fruit. So the example we like to use is linalool. Linalool is a terpene in lavender that makes lavender smell like lavender. Now, linalool also appears in a few different cannabis strains. So you look at this label here, you can see THC9, that's THC, delta 9 there. You'll see CBD. You'll also see LIN there. That is short for linalool, and so it includes those percentages there. Oh, and I forgot to say this middle point here. So earlier I mentioned how we think that CBD might alter the effects of THC. We call that the entourage effect, that interactions between cannabinoids and between cannabinoids and terpenes might cause different effects. So some example packages. This first one, this was on the back of an edibles product that just shows, you'll see that, I'll see if I can use the cursor to highlight, right in here, 10 milligrams THC and 2 milligrams CBD. Right? But it doesn't have any more breakdowns past that. And that would refer to each individually wrapped serving, of which there are 10 in this package. Now, a much more elaborate, comprehensive kind of package might look like this, where it not only has cannabinoids outside of THC and CBD, this one also has one called CBG. It also breaks down further. You see this, what's called THC acid and DHC. It's kind of hard to read, but DCRB. Now, without going into it too much, this essentially means in THC acid refers to an inactive form of THC. THC DCRB means it's gone through a decarboxylation process, and that basically means it's been heated up and activated. So this overall package has it breaks down the active cannabinoids versus the total cannabinoids. If folks have more questions on it, I'm happy to answer, but I'm going to move on for the sake of time. A little bit on CBD products. So CBD products tend to rely on CBD being extracted from the plant, typically a hemp plant. So if you ever hear of full spectrum products, this is the least processed form of a CBD product, and so it's going to have trace amounts of other cannabinoids, THC, CBG, and others. Broad spectrum, this is a process that specifically tries to remove just THC, and so you're left with all the other cannabinoids there, potentially CBD, potentially others. An isolate product, this is where CBD is what is isolated. CBD is they attempt to extract CBD only from the other cannabinoids. Now, these will have a lot of different carrier oils because cannabinoids are fat soluble, so they can bind to fat really easily. So you might see coconut oil, hemp seed oil, avocado, and a couple others. A lot of these products also have other additives, other plant extracts, different spices, different sweeteners, so on and so forth. Oh, I'm getting an interesting question. Can I explain the difference between THC and THCA? Yes and no. There's as little as we know about THC, we know significantly less about THCA. I will say that THCA will convert, it will become THC once it's heated up. So that kind of complicates that label even further, because some percentage of that THCA will become THC in that heating process. Now, I have come across some research in this that tries to predict, well, how much of this will convert, and there are so many factors. So there's not exactly a perfect formula out there that can predict that. Okay, we're going to talk just a little bit about older adult cannabis use. So what are the reasons why and how common older adult cannabis use might be? Oh, and it looks like, I'm sorry, I missed a couple other questions. One of them I don't know. What do you think of Effloria capsules for pain relievers? I don't know that product, honestly, so I apologize. I can't speak to that. I got another one here. Can I share any info or resources on lung cancer in cannabis smokers? I sure can. Stay tuned for the health correlation section. So getting ahead of ourselves a bit. All right, so how common is cannabis use in older adults? Well, a lot of caveats here. We do love our caveats and our context building at the Poison Center. We have a lot of data challenges with this, and a lot of this is because the data that exists is what we call self-reported. So folks are telling us, this is what I use, this is what I don't use, this is what I've done in the past month. And then I can have some issues I hardly remember what I did 2 days ago, let alone last month. So that can be a little tricky. A lot of this info is also pretty dated. So it comes from data from before legalization. And there's a lot of change in use patterns post-legalization, especially depending on where we're looking, right? So there's another limitation there. And another is that it's national data. So we don't really have a great honed-in perspective on Washington or even on a county level, which is what we'd love to see. Now, the information we do have tells us that cannabis use differs by age cohort. So folks aged between 50 and 64 years old, according to a 2019 publication, let me start that over. According to a few 2014 publications, there we go. We see a range here of 5.6 to 9.1% of this population, this age group, reporting cannabis use at least once in the past 30 days. Now, for folks who are ages 65 and older, we see this range of 1.3 to 2%. Same time frame there from 2014. Now, we have seen some general trends, though. The percentage or the proportion of older adults who report that they use cannabis use is going up overall, from what we can tell. Conversely, the percentage of older adults who perceive great risk or great harm from using cannabis is decreasing. And generally, we see these two trends correlate. So use going up oftentimes correlates with that perception of harm going down. So why do older adults use cannabis? Well, a lot of the reasons are folks report that they try to use medically, that they're trying to treat pain, help with anxiety, work on appetite or weight loss, deal with depression or insomnia. And now a lot of folks, I think Megan said this earlier, that someone may not have a medical marijuana card and they may be using medically. They may buy through a retail store in order to attempt to self-medicate for something. And a lot of folks report that they view medical marijuana as an alternative to other medication. All right, now we also have a few other factors, right? So we have baby boomers are aging. A lot of baby boomers may have partaken in cannabis use back in the 60s or the 70s. And now that it is legal, there's that increased access, there's that increased social acceptability, and once again, there's that decreased perception of risk or harm. All right, I'm going to take a breath and a sip of water, and then we're going to look at health correlations. So this is one of the, like I said earlier, the beefy sections of this whole presentation. So please hit me with questions as you have them.
And I'll just pop in while Alex is taking a sip of water. Just to let you all know that Alex and I aren't able to provide any sort of treatment advice or usage advice during this presentation. So I know I've seen a few comments so far of folks with specific conditions, and as much as we'd love to help you, we unfortunately cannot provide any sort of treatment advice. So just keep that in mind.
We should also say, following up with that, folks are absolutely welcome to contact the Poison Center for an information call. So you can call and ask about specific medication interactions. And they are equipped to give treatment advice significantly more than we are. All right, so to preface health correlations, we're gonna first talk a little bit about dependence and addiction. So dependence loosely occurs when the body or the brain starts to rely on some outside external substance to maintain normal function. So my kind of goofy example with this is coffee. I often joke that I have quite the dependence on coffee, which really means I have a dependence on caffeine. Now, the outside substance in this would be caffeine. The normal function in this would be my alertness level. And you better believe I've had quite a bit of cold brew in order to make sure I was kind of in the right alertness level to help lead this webinar today. So tolerance happens when we need to have more and more and more of that outside substance to maintain that normal function. So for me, when I first started drinking coffee, 2 sips and I was like bouncing off the walls. But as time has gone on and I've needed, life's gotten a little more complicated, I've had to have more coffee in order to maintain just that sort of bare level of awakeness. Now, this unfortunate and tricky thing happens with dependence and tolerance, right? So with dependence, once you, if you reduce or you quit the supply of that external substance, then we can experience withdrawal symptoms. And for me in coffee or caffeine, in this instance, I start to get cranky, I get lethargic, I sometimes get a headache. I feel like all coffee drinkers can probably relate to that. So then, broadly, addiction is when that dependence, that physical dependence, starts to become disruptive to other aspects of life. Very, very broad definition there. And it's worth noting that dependence is a symptom of addiction. Now, we bring this up for a few reasons. One of them is that there's a lot of rhetoric that cannabis is not addictive or is not doesn't have that physical dependence, or that it's not as addictive as other substances such as heroin or nicotine. There's a lot to tease apart there. One of it is that it does not take much to be less physically addictive than heroin or nicotine. Those 2 substances have tremendous physical dependence associated with them. Another aspect of this is that folks who report, users of cannabis who report quitting or reducing, often report that they experience withdrawal symptoms. And withdrawal implies dependence here. So with cannabis, what we found are common withdrawal symptoms include sleep disruption, anxiety, irritability, depression or depressed mood, and headaches. And these are just a few. Now, when these emerge totally depends on the person, depends on how much they were using, depends on their own endocannabinoid system, all that. But a lot of folks see these symptoms within 1 to 3 days of abstinence. They may peak between 2 and 6 days, and they can last up to 14 days or 2 weeks. Now, one of the big challenges with this on an individual level and on a research level is that these withdrawal symptoms, those 5 I listed there, are often confused with reasons for using cannabis in the first place. So I'll talk about sleep disruption first. Someone might use cannabis in order to help treat insomnia. And say it works. It may work. And if they develop that tolerance, they're going to need more and more and more. And if they quit, for whatever reason, they quit, they may get an increased version, even more sleep disruption following. So you get this sort of catch-22, this feedback loop. Excuse me there. So it adds a lot of confusion for a lot of reasons. All right, a little bit on cannabis use disorder. So we use the term dependence and addiction because they're very common, but there has been this diagnostic shift. The DSM, current diagnostic material, uses the term substance use disorder, and specifically, it's a substance-specific use disorder. So cannabis use disorder specifically refers to problematic patterns of use leading to social, occupational, physical, or psychological impairment or distress. So disrupting other aspects of life. And we want to bring this back to older adult use. So is there this risk of older adult cannabis use disorder? Absolutely. And there's even less research on this. There's not a ton of research on older adult substance use disorder, period. And again, there are a few reasons to this, but one of the biggest is that it's very difficult to diagnose. Signs and symptoms of cannabis use disorder, such as drowsiness or dizziness or memory impairments, can also be common in older adults without cannabis use disorder. So it becomes an issue of our question of what is actually causing this. Okay, so what we're going to do throughout the rest of this section is we're going to look at a variety of evidence statements that primarily come from these two sources. The one on the left is a 2017 review. The one on the right is from 2018. Now, what both of these did was they looked at as much evidence as they could get their hands on from other publications up until that point in time, and they went through and they basically graded all of these other publications and combined them all to say, okay, we have enough evidence to say, to make this type of statement about this effect or correlation from cannabis. But what we did, rather than listing off verbatim what all these phrases are or all these statements are, we sort of buddied up these levels of evidence with plain language statements and further linked them to a letter grade. So most of these slides are going to have a big letter grade up in the corner. Not all of them, but most of them. And now it is 2020, right? And so 3 years has passed since that one publication, 2 from the other. And there is more evidence all the time. So what we've been able to see, though, is most of these, all of these evidence statements, by our understanding, still hold up. If we go through any and you're like, oh my gosh, I just read an article that said something totally different than that, please send it our way. This is sort of this ever-growing, ever-changing training. We want to keep it as accurate as possible. All right, so I'm going to lay eyes on the questions section again. Someone asked if we were talking about terpenes. No more, not in any more detail than they did on the slide earlier on. All right, so this is the one and only conclusive evidence statement you will hear me say today. And that is that we know that cannabinoids, certain cannabinoids, are an effective treatment for nausea and vomiting for folks receiving chemotherapy. Now, these cannabinoids specifically come from an oral synthetic medication that is FDA approved, both nabilone and dronabinol. And these have been on the market for quite a while now, actually, and they've been used very, very effectively at treating nausea and vomiting. Now, they are synthetic, and they so closely match the chemical structure of THC that we could make a fairly accurate assumption that THC would lead to the same effect. Now, I should have prefaced this earlier. I apologize I didn't. This first section, if it's not obvious by the title there, this is all on therapeutic effects. Then we're going to switch and talk about health risks. Apologies for not framing that earlier on. All right, so we very likely know, this is a B level of evidence, that certain cannabinoids are an effective treatment for chronic pain management. Now, this evidence mainly comes from a group of products called nabiximols, which are not currently available in the US, but they are undergoing trials. They are used in Europe right now. And they use different combinations of THC and CBD. Now, pain is really tricky, right? So how cannabis helps with pain depends on the type of pain. So pain from tissue damage generally and largely comes from inflammation. But nerve pain can happen independent of inflammation. And we bring up inflammation because both THC and CBD are actually incredibly effective at reducing inflammation. One of the big concerns, though, especially with THC, is the development of tolerance and dependence if you're using long-term for chronic pain. And then folks would likely have to use more and more and more to achieve that same result. Now, cannabinoids, with nerve pain, they may actually weaken or dampen pain signals to the brain, but there's not very much research on this. It tends to be mostly animal studies. So just a little bit on cannabis versus opioids for chronic pain. This is on a lot of folks' radar these days. Now, a lot of folks report that they try to replace their opioids with cannabis, that they use both at the same time, or that they try to use cannabis to help taper off of opioids. Now, the evidence is really mixed with this. It's very unclear. There are no really clinical trials to date. Some animal studies suggest that cannabis may help with this. It may help prevent opioid dose escalation. It may help with the pain aspect. It may lower that overdose mortality. But again, we just really don't have robust evidence here. We put this image here, this billboard folks may recognize from a few years back, because this was a pretty infamous billboard that Weed Maps, which is it's a website that is a part of the cannabis industry. They were pushing really hard, citing the study. And the study itself wasn't bad, but they were misquoting that study. And the study did have quite a few limitations. So they were grasping at straws a bit with that one. So bottom line for that, we need more research. You're going to hear Megan and I say we need more research, way more than you want today. And cannabis itself is not risk-free. So we really just encourage folks to talk to healthcare providers before attempting any sort of opioid replacement with cannabis. Okay, we probably know that cannabis use is correlated with improved management of short-term sleep disturbance. So it may help with short-term insomnia coming from these different areas. So this is just what this research looked at. It looked at sleep apnea, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. Now, I want to emphasize short-term there because there's a lot to tease apart with cannabinoids and sleep. Looking at THC, there's some pretty good evidence that shows it might reduce how long it takes someone to fall asleep, but again, there's that concern for tolerance when folks have to use long-term. And then folks may have to deal with some less favorable side effects of THC use. CBD is a little odder. Again, we need more research on this, but one study found that CBD seems to be more of a stimulant in low doses and more of a depressant, makes you tired, makes you sleepier in higher doses. And it defined a high dose as 160 milligrams or more, which is a pretty hefty dose. So this could treat sleep disorders, maybe. Again, we need more research. And there's this lingering concern about unknown effects with CBD, as well as potential interactions with other medications. Now, we think it's important to try to highlight what we think it's ineffective for. So we may know that cannabis is an ineffective treatment or not good at treating dementia symptoms. Glaucoma, intraocular pressure, which is interesting because glaucoma is actually on the list of qualifying conditions for Washington State's medical marijuana program. And it may be ineffective for reducing the depressive symptoms associated with chronic pain. So there's so much nuance there, right? It could be very effective at helping with the pain, but maybe completely ineffective at helping the depression associated with that pain. So this is our sort of, well, we don't know category. We don't know if there's an association in any direction between cannabis use in the treatment of cancers, with loss of appetite, specifically associated with cancer, with irritable bowel syndrome, spasticity from paralysis, and Parkinson's motor system symptoms. Just a little bit on CBD. Again, extremely limited research on CBD. Most research is on animal studies. The human studies that we have found tend to look at oral administration or inhalation. So they haven't addressed topical preparations like Megan was talking about earlier. And again, having so little regulation and so many products really adds to the uncertainty as to what's in them. So there's such a gamble when it comes to CBD products. The only two CBD specific statements we could find in both of those publications were these. We may know the CBD is effective for improving anxiety symptoms in individuals with social anxiety disorders, but we don't know if CBD is an effective treatment for mental health outcomes for folks who have schizophrenia. So I know those seem pretty disconnected. It's just CBD is the only commonality there. A little bit more on CBD. This is looking outside of those sources. So it's worth acknowledging that Epidiolex, this is an FDA-approved medication that is in use right now. It was approved in 2018. It's totally CBD-derived, and it's apparently very effective at treating certain forms of epilepsy. Now, we've mentioned the anti-inflammatory properties. A lot of folks have a hope that the anti-inflammatory properties may help treat some of those neurological disorders. We also, some research has hope that there may be some treatment of drug addiction in other substances coming from CBD. But again, we need way more research before we can really dive into that. Okay, just a little pause for just a moment before we switch to the health risks. Let's see if there are any other questions. Not seeing any, so all right, let's dive in. First, we're going to talk about cancer. So, we very likely know of a correlation between heavy use, that's daily or nearly daily cannabis use, and pre-malignant lesions throughout the airway. Pre-malignant means precancerous. What's really funky with this, though, is that other research shows that we probably know that there's actually no correlation between cannabis use in lung cancer or head or neck cancers, which is kind of wild, right? Because you would expect, if we're seeing these pre-malignant lesions form, we would see higher rates of cancer, but for some reason we haven't been able to see that yet. The only cancer we've been able to find a distinct correlation with cannabis use is non-seminoma testicular cancer, which I guess could be a powerful deterrent if you're trying to, as a prevention strategy specifically for teenage boys. All right, a little more on cancer. We don't know of a correlation between cannabis use and other cancers. What's really odd, though, is we can actually see a lot of similar carcinogens. Carcinogens are cancer-causing agents that exist in both tobacco smoke and cannabis smoke. And we actually see more ammonia and hydrogen cyanide in that cannabis smoke than in tobacco smoke. Now, just because we haven't been able to pinpoint... I got a great question here. Was that for smoking? As the mode of use? Yes. So those were for smoking. Thank you for asking that. I should clarify that on the slides. Now, just because we haven't been able to pinpoint cancer with lung cancer with cannabis use does not mean there aren't other respiratory issues. So we very likely know of a correlation between cannabis smoking and overall worse respiratory symptoms. This can include chronic cough, phlegm or sputum production, and wheezing. We also can track more frequent chronic bronchitis episodes, and that is more specifically linked to long-term cannabis smoking. Bit of hope, though, for those respiratory issues is we probably know that there's a correlation between quitting cannabis smoking and a reduction in those respiratory issues. So those seem to be at least somewhat reversible. Switching realms a bit, we're going to talk a bit about psychosocial and cognitive correlations. So we very likely know, that's a big level of evidence, that heavy cannabis users are more likely to experience memory impairments. And for this study, this research actually found that these memory impairments lasted at least a week following abstinence. Now, that could be a withdrawal symptom. That could be an effect of the use itself. We're really not sure. But it is alarming if memory loss or memory impairments comes into play. Now, a little bit on PTSD. So we may know, this is only a D level of evidence, but we may know that cannabis use is linked with increased severity of PTSD symptoms for those who already have PTSD. And the most common reason that folks report using cannabis to help with PTSD is to help with sleep disturbance. Now, there's not a good sense of direction here. We can't say that one thing is causing the other. It could be that the more cannabis use is increasing the sleep disturbance. It could be that folks with more intense PTSD are more likely to try something like cannabis to help. But we don't know if cannabis use is linked with the development of PTSD. There's no data there just yet. Bit on anxiety. We probably know, this is a C level of evidence, that regular cannabis use is linked with increased incidence or new cases of social anxiety disorder. And we see a similar trend with just any anxiety disorder, but just a kind of a lower notch of evidence there. For some reason, there just happens to be a little more research on the social anxiety side right now. Now, with depression, we probably know that there is a correlation between cannabis use and an increased risk for later developing depression or other depressive disorders. What we don't know, though, is if we don't know of a correlation between cannabis use and a change in depression or depressive disorders for those who already have it. So we don't know if it makes symptoms better, worse, or otherwise. This is a pretty heartbreaking couple slides. So we probably know that cannabis use is correlated with suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and suicide completion. Now, and this seems to be a dose-dependent response. So more cannabis use is correlated with higher incidence of attempts and completion. Now, again, there are so many factors that go into this. We can't say cannabis use causes suicidal ideation, but we can see that overlap. A lot of the factors that may be leading to one may also be leading to the other. We have the Crisis Connections 24-hour crisis line here, and we'll have a couple other resources in the next couple slides. Just a little bit on intentional substance use during COVID-19. So intentional use is something that poison centers are always concerned about. So looking at Washington Poison Center, last year in 2019, 17% of all of our cases across all ages were intentional. And 11% of the same year, 11% of all of our cases of all ages were suspected suicide. Now, we bring this up because we are dealing with so much right now. Collectively, we all are dealing with more stress, more isolation. These can increase our risk of anxiety and depression. And this isolation and stress may actually increase our risk of substance use and self-harm and potentially suicide. So we want folks to know there are resources out there. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And then for immediate help after self-harm of yourself or someone you're with, immediately call 911. All right, so a little bit on CBD, health risks with CBD. We've alluded to some of this. There is a concern for liver injury. So liver is one of our, it's like our waste management system, right? A big player in that system. So the liver is where we break down all sorts of stuff. Now, having CBD may actually interact with some of the enzymes in the liver that help break down toxicity, and it might delay it. It might keep other substances in the body longer. There's a lot we really don't know about it yet, but the concern for liver injury is actually listed as one of the main side effects of Epidiolex. That's that seizure medication we mentioned earlier. Now, there is a 2018 report from the World Health Organization that stated that they could not identify any potential for that physical dependence. And they also noted that a concern with adverse reactions from interacting with other medications. To make this even more complicated, because CBD products are everywhere. They're often attached to a bunch of claims, a bunch of medical claims, and now misleading and false and unproven claims. This could actually delay someone from seeking proper medical care, proper medical diagnosis and treatment if they bypass that system and dive right into a CBD product. All right, we're gonna switch drivers again. Megan's gonna take over. I'm gonna lay eyes on the chat box again. Oh, got some questions about antidepressants in cannabis, and Megan and I cannot give treatment advice, so that's something I'd encourage you to either contact the Poison Center and ask about, or speak to a pharmacist or your doctor, your provider. Got another question. Can we recommend a study that compares the incidences of disorders with alcohol versus cannabis? That's a really great question. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Doesn't mean I haven't seen them. The first thing I do think of, though, this is looking at Washington youth specifically. Folks can take a look at what's called the Healthy Youth Survey. And it wouldn't speak to use disorders, but it would speak to self-reported youth use of a variety of substances. So that would at least get to part of your question there.
Alrighty, so we are on to our last section now, and it's going to be all about acute effects. So Alex covered some of the more longer term effects from cannabis to consider, but then there are definitely things that are in the moment that are important. So we're going to start with this slide, which I apologize, the graph is a little grainy on it, but it shows how the potency of cannabis has increased over time. So the text is pretty small, but you can see that the graph starts at 1972 and it goes up to 2016. And it shows the average THC content of cannabis. So you can see it has increased a lot over the years. So remember, Alex talked about how some older adults might start using cannabis again because they did so when they were younger. Well, they could very easily be taken by surprise with how much stronger cannabis is now, and they might end up experiencing much stronger symptoms than what they would expect to. So what are those symptoms? This slide shows how we categorize symptoms at the Poison Center, and we put them from mild to moderate to severe. The symptoms that someone experiences is going to be highly dependent on how much the person has used, how they used it, as well as how their body tolerates it. What's their metabolism like? What's their tolerance level? So generally speaking, though, mild or moderate symptoms can include being sleepy or having euphoria, so feeling very, very good, loss of social inhibition, giddiness, having some mood alterations. We typically aren't concerned when someone has symptoms like that. We do get concerned, though, when symptoms reach the severe level. So that can include dilated pupils, decreased tone, so muscles are really floppy, and coma is listed there too. There actually have been cases of temporary coma so far just with kids who have gotten into cannabis products. So you'll see that we don't have death on this slide. So far, there hasn't actually been any deaths that have been documented that have been from cannabis overdose. That doesn't mean, though, that cannabis use hasn't led to death or severe injury in some different way, because its symptoms can very much alter a person's ability to safely do some activities, like driving, which is actually this next slide here. So the acute effects from using cannabis can present a lot of concerns with driving, because THC impacts so many of the skills that are required to safely drive, like someone's reaction time or their coordination, their concentration. So this can put the user themselves and the people around them at much higher risk of accidents. In Washington, we're actually seeing an increase in polysubstance DUIs. So that's DUIs involving more than one substance. The most common combination right now is cannabis and alcohol. Alex and I have heard this really interesting phenomenon of people claiming to use cannabis as a way to sober up after drinking. But cannabis does not work that way. So it's definitely a big concern that folks are using it in this manner and then driving. Another risk is medication management. So cannabis often has cognitive implications. THC can really impair a person's attention, cognition, or short-term memory, while they are experiencing those symptoms of being high. An interesting thing too is that THC can also alter someone's ability to estimate how much time has passed. So someone who is high, they essentially can have difficulty knowing what the exact amount of time is that's passed. What's felt like a couple of hours may only be 30 minutes or vice versa. So all of these effects can really interfere with successfully taking medications. The whole time estimation piece might mean that someone takes their medications too close together, or memory and attention means that people might miss doses or they might double dose. And those effects on attention and cognition can also make it difficult to understand medication instructions if they're complicated or if there are special things that need to be done. Also related to medications is the potential for drug interactions. So regardless of how they are consumed, if they're smoked, if they're vaped, if they're eaten or drank, THC and CBD, they're both processed by the liver. Alex talked about this earlier. So when they're being processed, they can actually temporarily affect the body's ability to process other drugs that use that same liver system. This is what we call an interaction. So those other drugs, they can end up building up in the body, or they can have stronger or longer lasting effects, or they might not be as effective. So depending on the drug, that can be very harmful. I'm not going to go into the specific drugs that can interact because there are so many and it is so difficult to predict. We can generally share some things with you, though, that for some drugs, there might be an increase in the amount of drowsiness. Some increases your risk of bleeding. Others can have effects on blood sugar and blood pressure when they are combined with cannabis. But since these interactions are so hard to predict, it's really best to talk to a doctor or a pharmacist. Sometimes they might not be sure, though, so you can always call the Poison Center. Alex and I, we have talked to our call center staff, and they are very willing and very able to talk about potential interactions with people. So our final intoxication risk with cannabis use is falls. So this can stem from the effects that it has on coordination, concentration, reaction time, all of those things that we've talked about previously with other risks. But it can also stem from those interactions with certain drugs, the drowsiness, the blood sugar level changes, blood pressure effects. So if you or someone you know or someone you work with is interested in using cannabis or is using cannabis, there are some definite strategies that you or they can employ to make sure that some of these adverse effects don't occur. Medication management strategies are really the primary reason to prevent some of these from happening. So first and foremost, discussing any risks that are specific to your health, your body, your safety with a healthcare provider and a pharmacist, and then use some different organizational systems to make sure that you are staying on track with any other medications you take. So medication calendar can be one great way to mitigate any sort of memory effects from cannabis use. So we have a medication checklist that I've uploaded into the materials that you're welcome to download and use, but it doesn't have to be that specific system. You can use just a regular calendar on your phone. There are lots of cell phone apps that will help with reminders for medications. Using a pill organizer is another great system that can range or take a lot of different shapes and forms, like simple pill boxes to more complex ones that have audio and visual cues. You can get bubble packaging from pharmacies. Really talk to your pharmacy to see what's available. And then to check for any sort of interactions and to help your healthcare provider, pharmacist, and even if you call the Poison Center to help us really know what potential interactions could be, it's great to have a comprehensive, up-to-date medication list. So an effective list needs to include at least the name, dose, time, and any special instructions for each medication that's being taken. And that includes over-the-counter meds, vitamins, and supplements. So again, I've uploaded some materials that you all can download directly. They're also up on our website. There is a list development guide if you don't already have a list or need an updated version. And then there are some of these template worksheets as well that you can use. Ours is a little different than a lot of medication lists because we have folks use one template worksheet or one worksheet per medication, and then you can just throw it out when it's out of date. All right, Alex and I get asked this question all the time when we give this training. What do you do if someone is too high? We have heard some wacky methods of decreasing someone's level of impairment. I think we've heard pineapple juice and eating carrots, and I can't remember what some of the other ones are, but essentially there's no proven method to decrease someone's level of impairment. So what should they do? They definitely should not take any additional drugs. You might have heard that if you are feeling too high, you're too impaired, you should take some CBD and that will decrease that level. That does not work. You should not take any additional drugs. Don't put more into your system. Instead, just stay put and wait for those effects to naturally decrease. Don't drive. Be careful about falling. Have a buddy if possible. And you can always call us as a Poison Center because we are happy to help out in any way we can and provide any specific tips to your situation. One more time, this is our phone number. We encourage you to just put this in your phone right away. And I'm going to get onto this slide so that any folks who have tuned in on Facebook, we are done other than any questions that might come up. We do have a few polls for the remaining attendees that are on go-to training that we'll go through. As we're sending out these polls, please feel free to submit any more questions in the chat box, and we're happy to answer them in the last 10 minutes we have here. So we're going to start with a poll that asks how confident you are in knowing how to call the Poison Center. Oh, and it looks like it just got closed.
Oh, sorry about that, Megan. I think it closed before it fully opened.
Nah, it's all right. We can just skip that. All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, I think we can close that one. And we have one more here. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them out and put them in chat box for us. We got a few minutes left. We're happy to answer anything. All right, go ahead and close that one, Alex. And last poll, everyone. Thank you for doing all of this. All righty. Not seeing any questions just yet, but if you come up with any in the future, our email addresses are both there. Please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have anything specific to clinical questions, questions about your own condition or medications, please call the Poison Helpline. We have a question here on, will you email a link to the recording outside of Facebook if possible? So I will not be emailing a link out, but we will be posting this recording onto our YouTube channel in the next few days. So just check back there and you should be able to access that. And this recording will also be available on Facebook for anyone who has access to Facebook. If there are any more questions, please continue to ask them. We do have a quick demographics questionnaire that we would love for you to fill out if you're willing to, which just helps us collect a little bit of information on who we're reaching for some of our funders. We'll have Alex launch that. You can answer one question, all of them, none of them at all, whatever you're comfortable with.
While folks are filling that out, we got a question. Someone saying they bought CBD oil from Colorado and that the company said to take a larger dose to begin with. Is this bogus advice? I would be pretty cautious of it because, again, all the research limitations on CBD to begin with, and so we don't exactly know who this company is, where they got their information from, what that source is. So I'd be very cautious. I would speak with your healthcare provider, speak with a pharmacist, or call the Poison Center to kind of touch base before giving that a try. Oh, and someone is asking for the YouTube channel. See how well I can multitask. I'll try to pull it up. I'm going to go ahead and cut the stream itself. So thank you for the folks who are viewing us on Facebook. We hope to see you next time.